Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about the best way to turn on your combat robot, which is going to be either a switch or a link. Yes, I'm doing this video for real this time. There's a couple different ways to turn on and off your robot, and that's what we're going to be discussing today, and why you can't just use a normal rocker switch or toggle switch or something like that. So I'm going to be talking about the two most popular alternatives to that and why you would use one over the other and the pros and cons of both of them. So let's get started talking about links and switches. So you're building a combat robot, you need to be able to turn it on and off, of course. And turning it on and off basically means you need to take power from the battery and transmit that to the rest of the electronics. So the way that you would normally do this in the rest of the world is you would have some sort of switch that when you do this, it turns on. When you do that, it turns off. And that is just really problematic in combat robots because the amount of forces that we see could easily turn this thing off. You know, think of a rocker switch. If you get hit really hard from one side, it just turns off. And the thing about a combat robot is this is the most important piece of the robot. If there was a visible switch somewhere on the bot, no one would have spinning weapons. We would just design something that could go up to a bot and just do that instead. It would be far easier just to turn off that switch. So because there isn't a simple switch to turn off, that's why we do all these crazy weapons and everything else. And that's why we end up with things like this. So the switches are ultimately, these switches are just ultimately unreliable for this application. I was going to do like a tear down and show you how a switch works. There's a lot of videos on YouTube where you can see that, but basically you have a paddle that's at the bottom that just kind of spring-loaded flips back and forth to touch these contacts. Now, even if this top rocker isn't the thing that you're hitting, just the amount of shock and even vibration in just spinning a weapon like this could cause that to get an intermittent contact. We can't really rely on a spring-loaded plunger to press against something reliably enough to transmit power from the battery to the rest of the electronics, especially in the conditions that we're dealing with combat robots. So if the traditional off-the-shelf on-off switch is not going to work out for this application, what do? Well, there are a couple good options out there. And you know how every hobby has that one thing that kind of polarizes everyone, and some people are in one camp and other people are in the other camp? Well, this is one of those for combat robots. There's a couple wedges, but this is the main one out there. It's either links or switches. So over here we have switches, and these are something that you would normally have to buy. Fingertech makes one, Nbots makes one, Waiachi makes a couple different versions of them, and I do have links down below in the description for all of these so you can see where to get those. And then on the other side you have switch or links. Links are something that you would normally make yourself. There might be a couple people that make them that you can buy, but generally speaking, this is something that you kind of make and you provide specific to your robot. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of give you an idea of how each one of these work and how they function and just kind of generally what they are, and then I'll go into the pros and cons as I see them for each one of these. So let's start out by looking at switches. Both links and switches accomplish the same goal, just in slightly different ways. Here is a very simplified representation of the electronics that are inside a combat robot. You have a battery, you have the electronics, and then you have the motor. This is what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to get the power into the speed controller and then into the motor so it makes spin. And so, if we just kind of connect that like that, connect like that, and then, add some kind of signal into here, it will spin. So what a switch or a link does is it bridges the gap right here. So let's say we have the red and red. We want to break that link and then have something in the middle that acts as an intermediary to either stop or start that flow of electricity. Nice and simple. That is the basics of a switch. So the switch does that with a pin that sits inside or a screw that sits inside that basically jumpers these two plates together. So when you screw down that screw that's inside, it will make contact with both of these and make the current flow. Now a switch, on the other hand, is literally, or link, is literally just a link. Think of it as a jumper. It sits in the same spot, but it is literally just a little jumper that either plugs in or unplugs, and that is what regulates the flow of current through your circuit. The implementation of a link is pretty straightforward. You would just use the connector that is appropriate for the battery and the size of robot that you have. So if you have a battery that has an XT60 connector on it, you could just use a link that is made out of two XT60 connectors. Simple as that. Because that is the weak link, let's say, on your battery. That is the connection that everything is going through, so why not just use another XT60? Obviously, you got XT90, you got an XT30, you got a Dean's connector here. Anything you want can be used for a link as long as it has this, nice little connection to it. So that is the simplicity of using a link. Let's look at what makes a switch. So if you've ever watched combat robot competitions on TV or whatever, and you see someone come up with a Allen driver like this and do this thing, that is turning on and off the switch. We have a big Waiachi switch here that is used in heavyweights, and then over here we have a nice little dinky finger tech that I use in 1 pound and 3 pounds, and you can see they have pretty much the same mechanism. So let's crack one of these open and I'll show you what's going on inside. So here is what the inside of a Waiachi switch looks like. You have these large copper lugs with these little metal inserts on them, and on the other side you have this little plate. And if we screw this in, you can see that it moves out. So this plate is basically on the screw, so it moves in and out. And when you unscrew it fully, this piece will make contact with this piece, thus completing your circuit. So it's a really simple design. You basically just have the body for insulation, and then you just have the screw. There's a couple other little tricks in here, but that's basically it. You just have a screw in the front, unscrew, and that is that simple. If we look over at the finger tech, it's largely not that much different. See if I can split this open. This one has been pre-split, so it doesn't usually come open this easily. And might be hard to see in this angle, but it's pretty much the exact same thing. You have, prop it up, you have your two copper plates, and then you have a screw that just goes down the middle. So when you screw in the screw, it basically comes into contact with this copper plate and comes into contact with that copper plate, thus forming the circuit nice and easy. So which one is the best for you to use? Well, it depends. There are pros and cons to each. As I did in the April Fool's version of this video, I'm kind of dividing this up into some categories because in certain applications one is better and in other applications the other is better. So let's first talk about cost. Cost is the most obvious thing here. If you're a beginner and you're new to this hobby, and let's just say you don't know if you're going to be sticking with it and you just kind of want to try something out and see if it fits, definitely go with a link. It is going to be the cheaper option. If you have a battery, which you're going to need to have a battery, if you have a battery, chances are you already have the mating connector to go with it. And usually these are sold in like 10 packs or something like that. So you're probably going to have extra of these anyway. So the cost for you making a link is going to be next to zero. You're probably already going to have the appropriate connectors necessary to make a link. Now, switches, on the other hand, can be somewhat or relatively expensive. I forgot how much the FingerTech switch is. I could just look, but I don't feel like it. I want to say it's like 10, 20 bucks, something like that. It's pretty inexpensive. This big Waiachi switch is like close to $100, so they can get pretty pricey, but if you're building a heavyweight and you're worried about $100, well, that's something else. So switches are definitely less cost effective. They do cost some amount of money, and if you have one fail, you're gonna have to have a spare, so that cost is always gonna be about double, whereas with a link, you're probably gonna have enough of these spares sitting around, or someone in a pits is gonna have spares. So the cost is effectively nothing when you look at a link versus greater than nothing when you look at a switch. So there you go. I think the next category for this could be ease of use / convenience. Switches are less convenient to use, and let me explain. These need to be somehow mounted in the robot. You can't just go inside the robot with this Allen key and expect to hit the right place and start unscrewing it. It needs to be mounted, it needs to be thought out, it needs to be planned, and it needs to be somehow secured in its location. For instance, I have a little hole back here, it is in a fixed location, and this is the only way I can get to it. And if that moves around, well, I'm kind of out of luck. But generally speaking, you have to plan for it, and it has to be in a set location. A link, on the other hand, is a little bit more fluid. It can just kind of go wherever. Like if I just had a hole in the top of this robot and I could just dig my fingers around and pull out the link, well, you know, that could work. You don't really have to mount them per se. As long as you can kind of get inside roughly and pull it out, then there you go. So generally speaking, a link is going to be a lot easier to use. I've seen a lot of people that definitely have them exposed, which I don't understand why you would do that, but a lot of people do have them exposed where you can just walk up to the robot, grab the link, and pull it out. So in terms of a convenience feature and the ease of use feature, it's just easier to design around a link, whereas a switch, you really have to kind of think it through a little bit more. So now we move more into the fun categories. These are the categories to where I'm going to say something, someone's going to pause the video, they're going to scroll down and just start typing a bunch of angry comments. So here's where the controversial stuff starts. So let's talk about effectiveness. Effectiveness is basically how well does it do the thing that it's supposed to be doing? And this is where the debate really starts getting heated. So on one hand, you have the link. The link effectively closes off that circuit, completes that circuit, and does the thing. So does the switch. Let's just throw that out. Both of these accomplish the same goal. Now, in terms of keeping that going during the fight, you have a little bit of a difference as far as I see it. With a link, you have this problem. Now, granted, this is a link that I spent quite a bit of time on wet sanding and contouring and filing it down so that it was this loose. I did spend a lot of time getting it to be this loose. They're not normally even remotely this loose. But in the failure mode of a link, it's going to fall out. That is the main problem with a link. And I know, people are already pausing the video right now and scrolling down and saying that. The problem is that the way that this works is that this slips on. Well, it can slip off not just as easily, but it can slip off in that same way. Now, some people will zip tie this or tape it or do something else, but in my mind, that's against the spirit of the rules. The whole point is to have a quick disconnect of the bot so that if something happens, you can disconnect the bot. Like, why don't you go so far as to just soldering this in place or Loctiting it or gluing it or doing something else to where this can't be removed without a significant amount of force? If that's the case, then I feel like it goes against the purpose of what you're actually trying to accomplish. So, generally speaking, some people will say that they can put their link in a configuration, like let's say it fits inside a little pocket so that these two things can't slip out. That is definitely the case. You can make this in a way to where it's not going to wiggle loose. However, it's going to make it a lot harder to get to. So that is kind of my discussion about effectiveness in terms of a link. Now, if we look at the effectiveness of a switch, the switch's mechanism is much different, as I demonstrated before. You're actually tightening this thing in there. There's nothing really spring-loaded inside of here. There's really nothing that can fail per se. In this case, this is the thing that makes it stop working. In this case, unscrewing it, or I guess screwing it in this case, is what causes it to work. In a fight or in a competition, you don't really have a robot that goes around with an Allen key that's spinning and it just finds its way in the hole and screws it in. It doesn't really work like that. You could have a large amount of vibration that could cause that screw to back out, or I guess back in this case, something like that. But usually these do have some kind of mechanism inside that prevents that from happening. That's why this is in a plastic body, all sorts of things like that. So the failure mode on a switch is generally a bit different. The failure mode could be excessive vibration. It could be that you didn't tighten this down enough. I've seen that a lot with FingerTech switches. These tend to be a little bit more fragile and you can't really just torque down on them, and that screw can just kind of slowly back out over time. So that is definitely something that can happen, but generally speaking, this happens a lot less than the links falling out. If you look back at last season of BattleBots, if you look at BuggleBots, people had link issues. No one had switch issues, and this is the contentious point. Some people feel that the link is safer because of that reason. But generally speaking, if you properly implement a switch, you really shouldn't have that as your failure mode. So in the case of effectiveness, how good is it doing its job of keeping the robot on and then allowing you to turn it off? I definitely think that the switch is the better way to go. Sorry, I was just consulting my crystal ball, and apparently someone is going to comment about switches being fused in the on position. Let's talk about that. So back in the day, there used to be an issue with switches getting fused on. And basically what that means is you're running so much current through this mechanism that the screw and everything would basically fuse into place and you wouldn't be able to turn this thing off. This happens because of inrush current. So if you watch one of my other videos, I talk about the soft start circuit that we put into Copperhead or 250-pound BattleBot, and it prevents that inrush current from happening. So very simply, what happens is, let's say this is connected to the rest of your robot. You push this thing in or turn on the switch. There is a large inrush worth of current that is going through this switch all at once, and it's a large spike as everything kind of charges up. There's capacitors on this, stuff like that. It's like filling a swimming pool all at once. You have to fill everything up very quickly, so you get a large inrush worth of current. Now, in some cases, that can actually pit out some of these connectors, which creates a poor connection, and then as you run more current through that pitted connection then starts to fuse, and now this thing can't turn off. That is not the case of a bad switch, or it can happen with a link too. It's just that these tend to get replaced a lot more often. It can happen in both of these. Anytime you go from a non-connection to a connection and you have a large current draw, you will get something like that happening. The connection just doesn't like this happening. You need to do an inrush current limiter if that is going to be the case. And so if you're not doing an inrush current limiter and you are getting pitting on either the switch or the link, then that is your problem. It is not the fault of the link or the switch. And if you watch back on the soft start circuit, I actually was using a link during the testing to show you what could happen, and we ended up pitting out a link in that demonstration simply because it's not about the method of connecting it. It's just that simple, quick connection that creates the inrush. So an inrush current limiter should squash any of those issues. Okay, so now that I have a lot of angry comments, let's go into the next controversial subject, which is safety. So in talking about safety, I like to talk about a lot of different scenarios because combat robotics is not a new field. We've kind of been over this a lot of different times. So let's talk about scenarios. Let's say we have this beautiful, lovely Beetleweight combat robot, and we're halfway through a fight, and it just is in the center of the arena. The weapon spins up to full. It's not responding to the radio. The failsafe isn't working, and it's just on full speed in the battle box. What do you do? Well, you have two options. It could have been made with a link, or it could have been made with a switch. Which one is the safer one in this circumstance? Neither. Should anyone be going inside the box to turn this thing off when it's spinning at full speed? No human should be in there anyway, period. And the weapon spinning at full speed, it's only got 3 to 5 minutes worth of battery life, period. Let it die. There is no reason you're going to go in there with this and try and, fiddle with it to turn it off. And there's also no reason you should go in and try and find the link and pull that out. This is not the safety measure that you should be relying on. You should let it die. Now, let's say that the weapon is on outside the box. That is just a poor oversight. You shouldn't be turning on the weapon without the weapon lock outside of the box. Now, I understand the case of, oh, I was testing it and this happened and that happened. Yes, that could be a case, but I wouldn't use this as like the exception to the rule to where, oh, this is going to be the safer way to go. If this thing has the weapon on and you can't control it anymore, neither of these is really the safe way to go. Both of them require that you need to go near the bot and you need to possibly risk injuring yourself from the weapon. Now, in the case of a bot that doesn't have a weapon, like a wedge or something like that, both of these are equally safe. So I just really don't feel if there's a case that you have a runaway bot where the weapon is going, that either of these is really the right way to go. And for that reason, all bots that enter any competition from the 1-pound class all the way up to the 250-pound classes need to rely on a fail-safe mechanism with the actual remote or the controller. And the way this works is basically the signal that all the speed controllers see need to see a signal from your radio or from your transmitter. If they don't see a signal, if your radio's off or they don't have proper communication, everything will stop back down to 0. And this is usually done at the very first part of the event. It is the safety check-in. You check in your bot, make sure that the fail-safe works, and then you compete going forward. So I don't really see a circumstance where you would not rely on just the fail-safe mechanism of the radio. If the switch fuses on or the link fuses on and it's just in the on position, your radio should be on and your fail-safe should be working. If your fail-safe is broken, you have both redundant systems that have both failed, and I don't think that's a fault of the switch, and I certainly don't think that's a fault of the link or a fault of the switch. So I think safety is kind of a moot point with either of these. I don't think there's a reason that this is safer, because a lot of people seem to think that the link is safer because you could just run up to the bot and just pull that out. I think that is probably the least safe circumstance. The reason being is that this is harder to get to. It's harder to fiddle around with this Allen key and get it in the right position. In theory, I think the thought is that this could be screaming down the road and you just run up to it and just boom, yank out the switch. I just don't think that's a realistic circumstance. This is going to be harder to fiddle around with and turn off, but in neither case should you be approaching a running robot and try and turn it off. So if anyone is still watching and keeping score, I'm basically tied on links and switches. I feel that once the robot is on, the switch does a better job at keeping it on. However, the design and implementation and the cost definitely goes to the link because it's just a little bit easier to implement. Safety, I think, is kind of a moot point. Once the robot is on, I think both of them do an adequate job of keeping the robot on so that the fail-safe can work. And if you practice best robot practices and do everything according to the rules that all of the events have set up, I don't think either one of these has a pro or a con to it. I think both of them do their job. Now, the one thing that I'm not talking about, which I think is the big tiebreaker between these two, in my mind, is turning the robot on. In one case, you have the switch, which you can just go up to the robot and turn the thing on. However, in the case of a switch, you have to pretty much physically hold the robot or touch it or grab it, and I think that is the big issue that I have with links. I know there's a lot of talk about safety and other things, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't really matter. My biggest beef with a link is that you can't do it hands-free without touching the robot. I can go up to my robot like this and turn it on. I am nowhere near it. Well, I mean, I'm close to it, but I am not touching it. And if this thing were to spin out of control and start spinning, it's not a big deal. It's not that big of a thing. However, if there was a link buried inside of here, you cannot reasonably assume that you can go in there and plug this in reliably and to where it's going to stay with one hand without touching the robot. So many times I have run competitions where I see this kind of thing, where someone is doing this to get the link in. That is bad. I think that's a bad design, and I think that, for me, is the case on why people shouldn't be using links and should be using switches instead. If you have a situation to where you need to get your hands inside the robot, plug this thing in, tuck it inside, and then screw an access panel on, I don't think that's a safe way to turn on the robot, and that's why I prefer using switches. I also like switches for the staying on and the other reasons I mentioned, but I think that is the biggest issue that I have with links. And if you're going to watch any of this video, just watch that last 2 minutes. The biggest issue I have is that you have to physically manipulate the bot with your hands to get the switch in there or the link in there and secured to where it stays in there. And that is my biggest issue with links. I think we all need a nap after this video. This was a lot of information. It was a lot longer. When I start videos, I really never know how long they're going to end up being. I don't really script anything. So Hopefully you got a little bit something out of that. I know I do tend to lean towards the switches, as I've said in this video. I'm pretty clear about that, but hopefully there was still some good information in there. I think a properly implemented link is still a viable solution. I'm not sitting here calling for the banning of all links, and if you have a link, you shouldn't be coming in competition. I'm not. I just think that you have to be aware of some of the pros and cons of each. Like I said, if you have an issue with things fusing, you need to do a soft start circuit or some kind of inrush current limiting. And if you have a design that makes you reach in where the weapon is to get your link in, maybe redesign that. Maybe that isn't the right way to go. Just simply kind of pointing out the way I see things here. So hopefully you got some good information out of that, and hopefully you learned everything you ever wanted to know about how combat robots turn on and turn off. As always, you can check out my Facebook page for any updates. Check out the Amazon description down below to help support my channel. And please go ahead and just leave all your nasty comments down below about how wrong I am with all sorts of everything. I would love to read all of them and respond. So thanks for watching. See you next time.